God, He'll work on your heart. And if all the demons in hell and all the bureaucrats in the world could stop me from building, when I go to heaven, He'd let me work on mansions. You can't defeat me. You cannot defeat a child of God.
Number 1, Jim Bakker. In the 1980s, few figures in American television were as well known as Jim Bakker. To his millions of viewers, he was the polished, charismatic preacher who promised blessings and miracles to anyone who tuned in. But behind the glitz of his television ministry was a sprawling empire that would collapse in one of the most infamous scandals in religious broadcasting history. Jim Bakker's rise began in the 1960s, when he and his then-wife, Tammy Faye, launched a Christian puppet ministry. They were young, enthusiastic, and soon caught the attention of larger Christian networks. By the 1970s, Bakker had become a household name, first as a host on the Christian Broadcasting Network, and later as the founder of the PTL Club, short for Praise the Lord. The PTL Club wasn't just a show, it was a movement. With a mix of preaching, interviews, and entertainment, it felt more like a Christian variety program than traditional church television. By the early 1980s, Bakker's show reached an audience of nearly 20 million people across the United States. The money poured in. Viewers sent donations by the thousands, often inspired by Bakker's promises that faith-filled giving would lead to God's blessings in their own lives. PTL wasn't just a television show anymore. It became a massive operation headquartered in Fort Mill, South Carolina. At its peak, the PTL empire included a 2,500-acre theme park called Heritage USA, complete with hotels, attractions, and even a water park. It was billed as a Christian alternative to Disney World, drawing millions of visitors a year. But behind the spectacle, cracks began to appear. Bakker was accused of living lavishly on the donations of his followers, spending millions on luxury homes, expensive cars, and high salaries for himself and his inner circle. Heritage USA's finances became increasingly unstable, as money raised for religious purposes was funneled into maintaining a lifestyle that critics said was anything but humble. The breaking point came in 1987. News broke that Bakker had secretly paid hush money to a church secretary named Jessica Hinn, who accused him of coercing her. The revelation exploded into headlines, shocking his followers and tarnishing the carefully built image of a devoted man of God. But the scandal didn't end there. Federal investigators soon uncovered that Bakker had been overselling lifetime partnerships in Heritage USA hotels, promising more rooms than the resort could ever actually provide. In simple terms, thousands of faithful donors believed they were buying guaranteed vacation stays that didn't exist. In 1989, Bakker was indicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. His trial lasted 5 weeks and drew nationwide attention. Prosecutors argued that he had raised more than $150 million by deceiving his followers. The defense tried to frame Bakker as an overwhelmed leader who had lost control of his massive organization, but the jury wasn't swayed. He was convicted on 24 counts of fraud and conspiracy and initially sentenced to 45 years in prison, along with a $500,000 fine. Though an appeals court later reduced his sentence to 18 years, Bakker still spent over 4 years behind bars before being released on parole in 1994. The fall from grace was enormous. A man who once stood at the pinnacle of televangelism had become a symbol of corruption and greed in the church. His ministry was destroyed, his marriage to Tammy Faye ended, and his name became synonymous with religious scandal. After prison, Bakker eventually returned to television, launching The Jim Bakker Show in the 2000s. But this time, his focus shifted. Instead of prosperity gospel and promises of blessings, he began preaching about the end times, selling survivalist gear and doomsday food buckets to viewers preparing for apocalyptic events. While he found a niche audience, his reputation never fully recovered from the PTL scandal. The story of Jim Bakker still sparks debate today. To some, he represents the dangers of unchecked power in religious broadcasting. A man who built an empire on faith but lost it all through deception and excess. To others, his later years show a man trying, however imperfectly, to rebuild after public humiliation. But for most, his legacy remains one of broken trust, where millions of believers learned that even those who appear to speak for God can be tempted by wealth and power. Number 2, Jimmy Swaggart. In the 1980s, Jimmy Swaggart was one of the most recognizable names in American religion. His televised sermons reached more than 100 countries. His gospel albums sold millions of copies, and his ministry raked in nearly $150 million a year at its peak. He wasn't just a preacher. He was a global celebrity, commanding stadium-sized audiences and presenting himself as a moral compass for his followers. But the higher the pedestal, the harder the fall, and Swaggart's downfall would become one of the most sensational scandals in televangelist history. Jimmy Swaggart came from humble beginnings in Faraday, Louisiana. He grew up in a poor Pentecostal family, a cousin to other famous Louisiana musicians like Jerry Lee Lewis and Mickey Gilley. While his cousins pursued rock and country, Swaggart took a different path, dedicating his life to preaching and gospel music. By the 1960s, he had become known for his fiery sermons and emotional piano playing, slowly building a following. His television ministry began in the 1970s, and by the early 1980s, it exploded in popularity. His sermons blended passionate preaching with music, creating a style that appealed to millions of viewers around the world. By the mid-1980s, Swaggart had built a religious empire. He operated a Bible college, a publishing house, and a broadcasting network. He regularly criticized what he saw as moral decay in America, condemning everything from drugs and pornography to other preachers he believed were corrupt. One of his most public battles was against fellow televangelists like Jim Bakker, whom he accused of immorality and greed. To his followers, Swaggart seemed like a man above temptation, someone who stood firmly against the sins he so passionately preached about. But in 1988, Swaggart's world collapsed. Investigators in Louisiana revealed that Swaggart had been involved with a sex worker, a shocking revelation for a preacher who had built his reputation on moral purity. Photographs of Swaggart with the woman surfaced, and the news made national headlines. The man who condemned others from the pulpit was suddenly exposed for living a double life. The hypocrisy was too glaring to ignore. When Swaggart took to the pulpit after the scandal broke, his tearful televised confession became one of the most infamous moments in televangelist history. With cameras rolling, he declared, "I have sinned against you, my Lord," breaking down in tears before millions of viewers. While some sympathized, many saw it as a performance designed to salvage his ministry. Swaggart's church leaders defrocked him, stripping him of his preaching credentials. His reputation was badly damaged, but the scandals didn't end there. Just a few years later, in 1991, Swaggart was stopped by police in California after being seen with another sex worker. When questioned, his response was blunt. "The Lord told me it's flat none of your business." This second scandal confirmed for many that Swaggart hadn't changed, and it dealt another crushing blow to his credibility. Despite the controversies, Swaggart refused to disappear. Unlike Jim Bakker, who went to prison, Swaggart faced no criminal charges. He continued preaching through his family's ministry, slowly rebuilding a loyal but smaller audience. Today, his church in Baton Rouge still broadcasts services, though his influence is a shadow of what it once was. The public reaction to Swaggart's scandals was enormous. For critics of televangelism, he became the ultimate example of hypocrisy, a man who preached against sin while secretly living in it. For supporters, the story was more complicated, raising questions about forgiveness, redemption, and whether spiritual leaders should be held to higher standards than anyone else. Looking back, Jimmy Swaggart's story is a reminder of how power and influence can blur the lines between faith and fame. His downfall showed how quickly a public image can collapse when actions don't match words. And even though he still preaches today, his name remains forever linked to the scandals that brought down one of the largest ministries in America. Number 3, Peter Popoff. In the 1980s, Peter Popoff was hailed as a miracle worker. On national television, he wowed audiences by calling out strangers from the crowd, revealing their names, addresses, and private health struggles as if he had a direct line to God. For his followers, it was proof that the Holy Spirit was speaking through him. But behind the scenes, what looked like divine revelation was one of the boldest deceptions ever exposed in televangelism. Peter Popoff was born in Germany and raised in California, where his father was a minister. By the 1970s, he had built a name for himself as a traveling evangelist, preaching fiery sermons that promised healing and prosperity through faith. His ministry grew quickly, and by the early 1980s, his televised crusades drew massive crowds. Popoff's services were full of dramatic moments. People in wheelchairs standing up, believers claiming their illnesses vanished, and emotional testimonies of instant healing. The centerpiece of his act was his uncanny ability to pick out audience members at random, naming their personal details and declaring God's plan for their lives. To the faithful, this was nothing short of miraculous, but skeptics had questions. How could Popoff know so much about complete strangers? In 1986, those suspicions were confirmed in spectacular fashion. At one of his crusades, skeptic and magician James Randi, along with a team of investigators, used a radio scanner to uncover the truth. What they found was shocking. Popoff's wife was feeding him information through a hidden earpiece. Before the show, staff had collected prayer cards filled out by audience members, listing their names, illnesses, and addresses. During the service, his wife relayed the information to him from backstage, and he repeated it as if it were revealed by God. When Randi revealed the deception on national television, including recordings of Popoff's wife speaking into the hidden earpiece, the scandal rocked the religious world. Overnight, the man who claimed to hear God's voice was exposed as a fraud using a radio receiver. Donations to his ministry plummeted, and by 1987, Popoff was forced to declare bankruptcy. For many, that should have been the end of the story. But Popoff wasn't finished. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, he staged a comeback, this time using television infomercials instead of live crusades. His new approach focused on selling miracle spring water and religious trinkets that he claimed would bring financial blessings. Commercials promised viewers that if they used his water and followed his instructions, they would see debt erased, jobs secured, and money suddenly appear in their lives. Despite being repeatedly called out by journalists and watchdog groups, Popoff's ministry found a new audience. By targeting late-night television and vulnerable viewers desperate for financial or physical relief, he managed to rebuild a profitable operation. Reports estimated that his organization was pulling in tens of millions of dollars a year well into the 2000s. Critics accused Popoff of exploiting the poor and desperate, while defenders argued that faith healing was a matter of personal belief. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Investigative reports showed that the so-called miracle spring water was nothing more than ordinary tap water. Former followers shared stories of being pressured to give more money after initial donations. And yet, Popoff continued to broadcast his promises of healing and prosperity to anyone willing to listen. Today, Peter Popoff is still active, though his reputation remains deeply controversial. To skeptics, he stands as one of the most blatant examples of religious fraud ever caught on tape. To supporters, he is a man of faith whose critics can't silence him. What is undeniable, however, is that his exposure in the 1980s revealed just how easily charisma and showmanship can be used to manipulate trust. The story of Peter Popoff raises a question that still lingers. How many people were willing to believe in miracles, even after the curtain had been pulled back? And how many more continue to put their faith and money in promises that may be nothing more than smoke and mirrors? Number 4. Benny Hinn. Few televangelists have built a global brand quite like Benny Hinn. With his flowing white suits, dramatic healing services, and worldwide broadcasts, Hinn became one of the most famous prosperity preachers of all time. His services drew stadium-sized crowds, where people collapsed to the floor as he waved his hands, claiming to channel the power of God. But while millions believed in his ministry, critics accused him of turning faith into a spectacle and building vast personal wealth from it. Benny Hinn was born in 1952 in Israel to a Greek father and an Armenian mother. He moved to Canada as a teenager and later to the United States, where he began his ministry in the 1970s. By the 1980s, his healing crusades were drawing national attention. He became known for what he called the anointing, a spiritual power that he claimed could heal disease, break addictions, and bring divine blessings. Television networks quickly recognized the spectacle of his services, and Hinn's broadcasts were soon reaching audiences around the world. The imagery was unforgettable. Packed arenas with tens of thousands of people, an atmosphere charged with music and prayer, and Hinn walking across the stage, waving his jacket or stretching out his arms as people fell backwards by the dozens. For believers, it was proof of God's power working through him. For skeptics, it looked like mass theater. Regardless, the shows made Hinn one of the most recognizable faces in Christian broadcasting. Behind the scenes, the money flowed in. Hinn's ministry pulled in hundreds of millions of dollars, funded by donations from followers who believed they were sowing into God's kingdom. But reporters and watchdog groups began raising questions. Where was the money going? Investigations by outlets like Dateline NBC and the Los Angeles Times painted a troubling picture. Hinn was accused of using donations to fund a life of luxury, private jets, expensive hotels, and lavish homes. In 2007, he was one of 6 televangelists targeted in a Senate investigation into the finances of major ministries. The Senate report didn't lead to criminal charges, but it highlighted a lack of accountability in how donations were spent. Former staff members came forward with stories of questionable practices, from inflating healing claims to hiding extravagant spending. Critics accused Hinn of manipulating the desperate, people suffering from illness or poverty who sent money hoping for miracles. Despite the scrutiny, Hinn remained a major figure. His ministry operated in over 190 countries, and his broadcasts aired on major Christian networks. He also built a brand around prosperity teaching, suggesting that giving to his ministry could unlock blessings and financial breakthroughs for donors. This seed faith message drew both devoted followers and fierce critics, who saw it as exploiting people's hopes for profit. In later years, Hinn publicly admitted that some of his teachings had gone too far. In 2019, he announced that he was distancing himself from the prosperity gospel, declaring that the practice of promising financial miracles in exchange for donations was an offense to the Holy Spirit. The statement shocked many, though some observers questioned whether it represented a real shift or a rebranding effort. Even with his partial retreat from prosperity preaching, the controversies around Hinn's legacy remain. For his followers, He is remembered as a man through whom they experience real spiritual encounters. For critics, he is a symbol of excess and manipulation in televangelism. What is clear is that Benny Hinn reshaped the image of faith healing on television, combining spectacle, music, and charisma into a global phenomenon. The story of Benny Hinn leaves behind a divided legacy. Was he a vessel of divine power, or a master of performance who blurred the line between faith and theater? The answer depends on who you ask, but his impact on the world of religious broadcasting is undeniable, and his name remains forever linked to one of the most controversial eras in modern televangelism. Number 5. Kenneth Copeland. Kenneth Copeland is one of the most influential and most controversial televangelists in America. Known for his booming voice, fiery sermons, and unwavering promotion of prosperity theology, Copeland built a multi-million-dollar empire by preaching that faith and giving would lead to wealth and health. To his supporters, he is a man of God blessed with abundance. To his critics, he is the face of excess in modern Christianity. Copeland's journey began in Texas in the 1960s. Before ministry, he briefly pursued a career in music, even releasing a single that charted in the Billboard Top 40. But his life changed after a spiritual conversion. He studied under evangelist Oral Roberts, and by the late 1960s, he launched Kenneth Copeland Ministries with his wife, Gloria. From the start, Copeland embraced the Word of Faith movement, which taught that positive confession and giving to the church could unlock blessings from God. Through television broadcasts, books, and massive conferences, Copeland's message spread quickly. His ministry grew into a global enterprise, complete with its own airstrip, a Bible college, and a sprawling headquarters near Fort Worth, Texas. The image of prosperity wasn't just preached from the pulpit, it was lived out in plain view. Copeland accumulated private jets, luxury cars, and multiple lavish homes. To him, this was proof of God's favor. To outsiders, it looked like exploitation of faith for personal gain. Criticism intensified in the 2000s, when investigative journalists began spotlighting Copeland's wealth. In 2007, he was one of 6 televangelists targeted in a Senate inquiry into financial transparency in religious ministries. While no charges were filed, the investigation raised serious concerns about the lack of oversight in organizations like his. Copeland's ownership of multiple private jets drew particular attention. When questioned why he needed them, he argued that commercial planes were full of demons, a statement that fueled public backlash and late-night comedy ridicule. Despite the criticism, Copeland's ministry continued to thrive. His followers defended his lifestyle as biblical prosperity, pointing to scriptures that emphasize abundance and blessing. Meanwhile, watchdog groups accused him of selling false hope to the sick and desperate by promising that donations would bring healing and financial miracles. Copeland's notoriety grew again in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. As the virus spread, he made headlines for declaring that he had blown the wind of God to destroy the disease, an incident that went viral online. He was also criticized for continuing to hold services and asking for donations while millions of Americans faced economic hardship. Over the decades, Kenneth Copeland has become a symbol of the prosperity gospel, both its appeal and its dangers. His empire continues to operate on a massive scale, broadcasting worldwide and training new generations of ministers in his teachings. To his devoted supporters, he represents faith, victory, and the rewards of belief. To his critics, he epitomizes the blending of religion and unchecked wealth. The legacy of Kenneth Copeland raises enduring questions about faith and money. Can prosperity be a sign of divine blessing, or does it cross into exploitation when built on the donations of struggling believers? Whatever the answer, Copeland's name has become inseparable from the modern prosperity movement, and his influence on televangelism is undeniable. Number 6. Creflo Dollar. Creflo Dollar became one of the most recognizable prosperity preachers in America by building his ministry around a simple promise that faith, obedience, and giving would lead to financial success and divine blessing. With his polished style and confident delivery, Dollar attracted thousands of followers to his megachurch in Atlanta and millions more through his television broadcasts. But along with his rise came fierce criticism, as his ministry's lavish spending made him a symbol of excess in modern televangelism. Creflo Dollar was born in Georgia in 1962. After studying at West Georgia College, he founded World Changers Ministries in 1986 with just 8 people in a cafeteria. The ministry grew rapidly, and within a few years, he opened World Changers Church International in College Park, just outside Atlanta. The church expanded into a massive facility known as the World Dome, seating over 8,000 people. At its peak, the congregation numbered in the tens of thousands, and Dollar's sermons were broadcast internationally. From the start, Dollar preached a prosperity message. He told followers that financial giving was a key to unlocking God's blessings, often using the phrase "sow a seed" to describe the act of donating. For many struggling with poverty, the idea that faith could change their financial reality was powerful. His confident, business-like delivery made him stand out from other preachers, and he quickly became one of the leading voices in the Word of Faith movement. But as his church grew, so did scrutiny of his lifestyle. Reports revealed that Dollar owned multi-million-dollar homes in Atlanta and New York, along with luxury cars and private jets. To supporters, this was evidence that his teachings worked. He was living proof that prosperity followed faith. To critics, it was exploitation. A preacher becoming rich off donations from believers who often had far less than he did. In 2007, Dollar was one of 6 televangelists investigated by the U.S. Senate for potential financial abuse. Though the inquiry ended without formal charges, it drew widespread attention to the lack of transparency in his ministry's finances. The controversies didn't stop there. In 2015, Dollar faced heavy backlash when he launched a campaign asking his followers to help fund a $65 million Gulfstream jet. He argued that the plane was necessary for spreading the gospel worldwide, but the request sparked outrage across media outlets, with many seeing it as a symbol of televangelist greed. The campaign was eventually pulled, but the damage to his reputation lingered. Dollar has also faced personal controversies. In 2012, he was arrested after an altercation with his teenage daughter, though the charges were later dropped. While he denied wrongdoing, the incident further fueled debates about whether his public image matched his private life. Despite the criticisms, Dollar's ministry continues. His church remains one of the largest in the United States, and his broadcasts still reach global audiences. He has also defended his teachings, arguing that prosperity preaching is about hope and faith, not greed. For his followers, he remains a charismatic leader who inspires them to believe for more. For his detractors, he is a symbol of the dangers of linking faith too closely with wealth. The story of Creflo Dollar highlights the tension at the heart of the prosperity gospel. Is wealth proof of divine favor, or does it reveal how faith can be exploited for profit? Whatever the answer, Dollar's legacy as one of the most controversial megachurch leaders of his era is firmly established, and his name continues to spark debate about the role of money in modern Christianity. Number 7. Ted Haggard. In the early 2000s, Ted Haggard wasn't just a preacher. He was one of the most powerful religious figures in America. As the founder of New Life Church in Colorado Springs and the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, he represented tens of millions of believers. He advised presidents, sat on panels with world leaders, and was seen as a leading voice for moral and family values in the United States. But in 2006, his name became synonymous not with spiritual leadership, but with one of the most dramatic falls from grace in modern evangelical history. Haggard's story began in 1984, when he and his wife Gail started New Life Church with just a small group meeting in their basement. His preaching style was energetic, relatable, and focused on themes of growth, family, and modern relevance. Unlike traditional pastors who relied on formality, Haggard had a gift for communication that made him approachable. By the 1990s, his church was exploding in size. Within 2 decades, New Life had grown into a sprawling megachurch with more than 14,000 members, complete with a 7,500-seat auditorium and a reputation as one of the fastest-growing congregations in America. But Haggard wasn't just a local success story. In 2003, he was elected president of the National Association of Evangelicals, a coalition representing around 30 million Americans. That role gave him influence at the highest levels of politics. He became a regular visitor to the White House during George W. Bush's presidency, offering counsel on issues like same-sex marriage, abortion, and family policy. Media outlets began calling him one of the most important religious leaders in the country, a man whose words could shape public policy. What made the rise even more striking was Haggard's public image. He was outspoken against what he called the decline of moral values in America, and he was especially vocal about his opposition to same-sex marriage. He frequently presented himself as a defender of the traditional family and a champion of biblical morality. To millions of followers, he seemed like a man living exactly what he preached. That image shattered in November 2006. A Denver man named Mike Jones, who worked as a male escort, came forward with explosive allegations. He claimed that over a 3-year period, Haggard had paid him for sex and had also purchased methamphetamine during their encounters. The story spread like wildfire. At first, Haggard denied everything, even telling reporters he had never met Jones. But within days, evidence surfaced, including a recorded voicemail where Haggard's voice could be heard asking for drugs. The contradictions in his story only deepened the scandal. As the pressure mounted, Haggard admitted to portions of the allegations. He acknowledged buying meth, though he claimed he never actually used it, and he confessed to what he described as sexual immorality. The once powerful leader was suddenly exposed as a man living a double life, preaching moral purity from the pulpit while secretly engaging in the very behaviors he condemned. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Haggard resigned from his position at New Life Church and stepped down as president of the National Association of Evangelicals. A group of church leaders announced that he would enter what they called a restoration process, designed to rehabilitate him spiritually and emotionally. For months, headlines focused on his disgrace, and late-night comedians turned him into a punchline. For the members of New Life Church, the scandal was traumatic. Thousands of families had built their spiritual lives around Haggard's leadership, and now they were grappling with betrayal. Attendance at the church plummeted in the months following his departure, and trust in leadership was shaken to the core. For many evangelicals nationwide, the scandal was an embarrassment that critics of religion seized upon as an example of hypocrisy. Haggard and his family left Colorado for a time, retreating from the public eye, but he never stayed gone for long. By 2010, he had resurfaced in Colorado Springs to launch a new congregation called St. James Church. He positioned himself as a humbled leader who had experienced failure but believed in second chances. His new church never reached the size or influence of New Life, but it attracted a small, loyal group of followers who accepted his message of grace after disgrace. Over the years, more accusations surfaced, including claims from young men who alleged inappropriate behavior by Haggard. While none of these led to criminal convictions, they kept his name in the headlines and added to the controversy surrounding his attempts at a comeback. Each time, Haggard denied wrongdoing or framed the events as misunderstandings, but the repeated scandals made it impossible for him to ever regain the stature he once held. The legacy of Ted Haggard is deeply complex. To some, he is a cautionary tale about the dangers of power, secrecy, and hypocrisy within religious leadership. His story highlights the way influence and image can crumble overnight when private behavior contradicts public preaching. To others, his life is a study in resilience, a man who, despite enormous public failure, continued to seek a platform and rebuild in whatever way he could. What remains undeniable is how shocking his fall was at the time. In less than a week, he went from advising presidents to admitting scandal on national television. For the evangelical movement, it was a moment that exposed just how fragile public trust can be when leaders hold themselves to a higher standard. And for millions who once looked to Ted Haggard for guidance, the question lingers. How much faith should anyone put in a man, no matter how powerful his pulpit may be? Number 8. Eddie Long. In the 1990s and 2000s, few pastors in America had the reach and influence of Eddie Long. He was the senior pastor of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia, a congregation that grew from a few hundred members into a megachurch of more than 25,000. His charisma, bold preaching style, and embrace of prosperity theology made him a star not just in the black church community, but across the wider evangelical world. Yet by the end of his career, Long's legacy would be overshadowed by scandal, lawsuits, and controversy that rocked his church to its core. Eddie Long was born in North Carolina in 1953 and raised in a working-class family. He attended North Carolina Central University and eventually moved into ministry work, first serving in smaller churches before joining New Birth in 1987. At the time, the congregation had about 300 members. Long brought energy, vision, and a flair for showmanship. Within a decade, membership had exploded, and New Birth had become one of the largest and most influential megachurches in the South. Long's message combined traditional biblical preaching with modern prosperity teaching. He spoke about financial success as evidence of God's favor and encouraged his followers to believe that faith could transform not only their spiritual lives, but also their material circumstances. His style was passionate and theatrical, often punctuated with fiery declarations and dramatic gestures. By the early 2000s, Long was not just a preacher. He was a celebrity pastor, invited to high-profile events, featured in national media, and courted by politicians. His influence extended beyond the pulpit. In 2006, Long hosted the funeral of Coretta Scott King, widow of Martin Luther King Jr., an event that brought national attention and underscored his role as a leader in Atlanta's black community. He also led initiatives that promoted business development and community empowerment, casting himself as a voice for both spiritual and economic progress. But beneath the surface, controversy was brewing. Long's lifestyle drew criticism, particularly his embrace of wealth. He drove luxury cars, wore designer suits, and lived in a multi-million-dollar mansion, all funded by a church that encouraged generous giving. To critics, this contradicted the humility expected of a pastor. To supporters, it was proof of God's blessing on his ministry. The turning point came in 2010, when 4 young men filed lawsuits against Long, accusing him of using his position to coerce them into sexual relationships. The allegations shocked his congregation and the broader public. The men claimed that Long lavished them with gifts, trips, and money, all while grooming them for inappropriate encounters. The scandal exploded in the media, not only because of the accusations themselves, but because Long had been an outspoken opponent of same-sex marriage and homosexuality. For years, he had preached about the importance of traditional family values, and now he was accused of living in direct contradiction to those teachings. Long denied the allegations, standing before his congregation in September 2010 and declaring, "I am not the man that's being portrayed on television. I am not a perfect man, but this thing I'm going to fight." His refusal to step aside and his insistence on continuing to preach sparked both loyalty and outrage. Some members rallied around him, convinced the lawsuits were attacks on a man of God. Others left the church, disillusioned and betrayed. The lawsuits never went to trial. In 2011, Long reached a confidential settlement with the four men, estimated to be in the millions of dollars. While the settlement avoided a courtroom battle, it left lingering questions. To many outside observers, it looked like an admission of guilt, though Long himself never publicly confessed to wrongdoing. The damage to his reputation was enormous. In the years that followed, Long attempted to restore his image. He continued to preach at New Birth, though attendance dropped dramatically. From a peak of over 25,000 members, the congregation dwindled by the thousands. The scandal also opened broader conversations about accountability in megachurch leadership and the dangers of unchecked power. Adding to the turbulence, Long's health began to decline. In 2016, he appeared publicly having lost a significant amount of weight, sparking rumors and concern. He initially claimed he was simply on a new vegan diet, but it became clear he was seriously ill. On January 15, 2017, Eddie Long died at the age of 63 after a battle with cancer. His death brought mixed reactions: sorrow from those who had loved and followed him, and bitterness from those who felt betrayed by his actions. The legacy of Eddie Long remains deeply divided. For some, he was a visionary pastor who built one of the largest churches in America, empowered his community, and preached a message of hope. For others, he was a hypocrite whose actions damaged trust in the church and left lasting wounds on those who looked up to him. What is clear is that Eddie Long's rise and fall reflected both the power and the peril of the megachurch movement. His story highlights how charisma and influence can inspire thousands, but also how quickly it can unravel when accountability and integrity fail. In the end, the man who once stood as one of the most prominent voices in American Christianity left behind a legacy forever shaped by scandal and controversy. Number 9. Joel Osteen. Joel Osteen isn't just a preacher, he's a brand. With his wide smile, positive messages, and sold-out arenas, Osteen has become one of the most famous religious figures in the world. He leads Lakewood Church in Houston, Texas, the largest megachurch in America, with weekly attendance in the tens of thousands and millions more tuning in online and on television. His books have topped the New York Times bestseller list, and his sermons have been broadcast in over 100 countries. But with his fame has come controversy, and for critics, Osteen represents the prosperity gospel at its most polished and most problematic. Osteen's rise to prominence began almost by accident. Born in Houston in 1963, he grew up in the church his father, John Osteen, founded. Joel wasn't initially drawn to preaching. Instead, he studied radio and television production and worked behind the scenes as a media producer for his father's sermons. But in 1999, John Osteen passed away suddenly. Joel, then 36 years old, stepped into the pulpit for the first time. His soft-spoken, upbeat style was different from his father's fiery preaching, but it resonated. Within a year, he became the senior pastor of Lakewood Church, and under his leadership, the congregation exploded in size. Lakewood moved into the former Compaq Center, a sports arena in Houston that once hosted the NBA's Houston Rockets. Renovated into a modern worship space, seating over 16,000, it symbolized Osteen's vision. Faith presented on the biggest stage possible. Services featured professional-level music, massive screens, and Osteen delivering messages focused less on sin and judgment and more on encouragement, hope, and personal success. For many, this was a refreshing approach to Christianity. But Osteen's style also drew criticism. Unlike many traditional preachers, he rarely talked about hell, sin, or repentance. Instead, his sermons emphasized God's desire for people to live their best life now, a theme echoed in his best-selling books. Critics accused him of promoting a shallow form of Christianity that equated faith with self-improvement and financial prosperity. To supporters, however, Osteen was simply making faith accessible to millions who might otherwise ignore it. As Lakewood grew, Osteen became a household name, appearing on talk shows, selling millions of books, and even holding large events in stadiums across the country. But with this level of fame came scrutiny of his wealth. Osteen lives in a mansion valued at over $10 million, and while he often notes that he no longer takes a salary from Lakewood, relying instead on book royalties and speaking fees, his lifestyle has fueled accusations that he embodies the very prosperity gospel critics warn against. One of the biggest controversies of his career came in 2017, when Hurricane Harvey devastated Houston. As floodwaters displaced thousands of residents, Lakewood Church was initially criticized for not immediately opening its doors as a shelter. Social media exploded with accusations that the nation's largest megachurch was turning away people in need. Osteen responded by saying the church had always planned to open when city shelters filled, and that flooding near the church made it unsafe in the early days of the storm. Still, the backlash was intense, and the incident remains a stain on his public image. Another flashpoint came in 2021, when news broke that Lakewood Church had received $4.4 million in federal Paycheck Protection Program loans during the COVID-19 pandemic. Although the church later repaid the funds, critics argued that a megachurch led by a multimillionaire pastor shouldn't have applied for government aid at all. Osteen's defenders countered that the funds went to support staff salaries, not personal wealth, but the controversy reignited debates about how churches use their resources. Despite these controversies, Osteen's popularity has endured. His books continue to sell, his sermons attract millions of views online, and Lakewood remains a powerhouse of American Christianity. For his followers, Osteen is a source of hope and encouragement in a world filled with negativity. His messages about faith, confidence, and resilience resonate with people facing struggles in their daily lives. But for his detractors, Osteen represents something else entirely: the commercialization of faith. They argue that his focus on positive thinking and material success turns Christianity into little more than motivational speaking, and that his wealth creates an unbridgeable gap between him and the struggling people he preaches to. Joel Osteen's story is a reminder of the unique place megachurch pastors occupy in American culture. They are not just religious leaders, they are celebrities, authors, and influencers with reach that extends far beyond the walls of their churches. Whether seen as a man of God bringing encouragement to millions, or as a polished salesman of prosperity, Osteen's influence is undeniable. His legacy will likely always be debated. To his critics, he is proof that the line between ministry and business can blur until it's almost invisible. To his millions of fans, he is the pastor who tells them that no matter what they're facing, their best days are still ahead. And in the end, that message, simple, positive, and endlessly repeatable, is what has made Joel Osteen one of the most famous and controversial preachers of his time. Number 10. Apollo Quiboloy. In the Philippines, few religious leaders have built a following as large or as controversial as Apollo Quiboloy. He calls himself the Appointed Son of God, a title that has drawn millions of devoted followers and fierce criticism from skeptics around the world. To his supporters, Quiboloy is a modern prophet with divine authority. To his critics, he is a cult leader who has used faith to amass power, wealth, and influence. His ministry reaches far beyond his home country, with international broadcasts and global branches, but his reputation has been marred by scandals, lawsuits, and even criminal charges in the United States. Apollo Quiboloy was born in 1950 in the southern Philippines, the youngest of 9 children in a poor family. His rise from poverty to global prominence is part of what makes his story compelling to his followers. In 1985, he founded the Kingdom of Jesus Christ, the name above every name, in Davao City. From the beginning, his teachings were striking. Quiboloy declared himself the appointed Son of God, chosen to establish God's kingdom on earth. His message centered on obedience to his authority as a divine representative, setting him apart from traditional Christian leaders. The church grew rapidly. With a mixture of fiery preaching, strict discipline, and promises of prosperity, Quiboloy attracted thousands of followers. His ministry expanded across the Philippines and into the United States, Canada, and beyond. By the 2000s, he had built a sprawling religious empire that included media networks, universities, and massive worship facilities. His sermons were broadcast worldwide through television, radio, and later social media. To his followers, he became a figure of almost unquestioned authority. But along with the growth came controversy. Critics accused Quiboloy of running his church like a cult, with strict control over members' lives and finances. He was known for his lavish lifestyle, including private jets, luxury cars, and sprawling estates, funded by the tithes and donations of his followers. While he argued that these were blessings of God's favor, detractors saw them as signs of exploitation. The scandals grew more serious in the 2000s. In the Philippines, Quiboloy was investigated for land disputes and allegations of abuse within his ministry. His close relationship with former President Rodrigo Duterte, a longtime friend from Davao City, fueled further debate. Quiboloy was often described as a spiritual advisor to Duterte, and his political influence raised alarms about the intersection of religion and power. Internationally, the controversies escalated. In 2021, Quiboloy and several associates were indicted in the United States on charges of sex trafficking, fraud, and money laundering. Federal prosecutors alleged that Quiboloy's church used its influence to coerce young women into sexual acts and to send members abroad under false pretenses to raise funds for the ministry. The indictment painted a disturbing picture of abuse and manipulation, drawing global headlines. Quiboloy denied the charges, claiming he was being persecuted for his faith, but the case placed him on the FBI's most wanted list in 2022. Despite these allegations, Quiboloy's ministry has continued to operate. His broadcasts still reach millions, and his followers remain loyal, often dismissing the accusations as attacks from outsiders who do not understand his mission. In the Philippines, he retains a powerful base of support, and his name remains a fixture in the country's religious and political conversations. The public reaction to Quiboloy is sharply divided. For his critics, he represents the worst abuses of religious authority, a man who cloaked himself in divine titles while exploiting those who trusted him. For his followers, he is a chosen vessel of God, a leader whose trials are seen as proof of his prophetic calling. What makes Quiboloy's story especially significant is its global dimension. Unlike many televangelists, whose influence is mostly national, his reach has crossed borders, bringing his message and his controversies onto the international stage. The FBI charges ensure that his legacy will not only be a religious matter, but also a legal one, with potential consequences that stretch far beyond the pulpit. In the end, the story of Apollo Quiboloy forces us to confront difficult questions about faith, power, and accountability. How far should people go in placing trust in spiritual leaders? And what happens when a leader's claims of divine authority collide with allegations of human wrongdoing? Whether seen as a prophet or a fraud, Quiboloy's legacy is one of the most polarizing in modern religion, and his name will remain tied to both his vast influence and the scandals that have defined his rise. Number 11. Ernest Angley. For decades, Ernest Angley was a familiar figure on American television. With his trademark toupee, flamboyant preaching style, and healing crusades, he built a ministry that stretched far beyond his home in Ohio. His programs aired worldwide. His cathedral in Akron became a local landmark, and to many, he was a trusted man of God. But in his later years, Angley's legacy became clouded by scandal, with allegations of abuse, financial exploitation, and misconduct that overshadowed his long career. Ernest Angley was born in 1921 in North Carolina. He began preaching in his teens and quickly gained a reputation as a fiery evangelist with a passion for healing and revival. By the 1950s, he had founded Grace Cathedral in Akron, Ohio, and built a loyal following. His television program, The Ernest Angley Hour, became a staple on Christian networks, where his dramatic healing services drew large audiences. Angley's booming voice and showmanship made him instantly recognizable, and for decades he presented himself as a man chosen by God to heal the sick and spread the gospel. At its peak, his ministry owned a 5,000-seat cathedral, a television station, and a sprawling network of global outreach programs. His services were theatrical, often featuring long prayer lines where he laid hands on the sick and declared them healed. To his supporters, these were moments of divine power. To skeptics, they looked like staged performances. Regardless, the combination of faith and entertainment kept his ministry thriving for decades. But as Angley aged, darker stories began to emerge. Former members of his church accused him of exercising authoritarian control over their lives. Some alleged that he pressured women in the congregation to undergo abortions, while others claimed he exerted manipulative control over marriages and personal decisions. In 2019, a lawsuit accused Angley of sexually abusing a former male employee, allegations that shocked even longtime followers. Though Angley denied the accusations, the lawsuit drew widespread media attention. Financial scandals also haunted his later years. Reports revealed that Angley's ministry was deeply in debt, and former members claimed that he pressured congregants into giving beyond their means. In 2019, Grace Cathedral filed for bankruptcy protection, listing tens of millions of dollars in liabilities. What had once been one of the most visible ministries in Ohio now faced financial collapse. Ernest Angley passed away in May 2021 at the age of 99. At the time of his death, his reputation was sharply divided. To loyalists, he was a man who dedicated his life to preaching and healing, whose television programs brought hope to millions. To his critics, he was a manipulative leader whose legacy was stained by allegations of abuse and exploitation. The story of Ernest Angley is a reminder of the complicated legacies many televangelists leave behind. His life spanned nearly a century, and for much of it, he commanded the attention of audiences around the world. But in the end, his name became synonymous not only with healing crusades and global broadcasts, but also with accusations that called into question the very integrity of his ministry. Across these stories, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore: the danger of unchecked power in the pulpit. Each of these preachers built massive followings, shaped communities, and presented themselves as voices of faith, yet their scandals left behind broken trust, disillusioned believers, and headlines that stretched across the world. It's a reminder that charisma is not the same as character, and that faith placed in people can often be shaken. Which case shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.